Welcome to another Lunch with Philip and Greg. Our guest today is Oliver Peters, an editor and colorist and occasional journalist, and his moonlight moments. Just describe a little bit as to what you do.
Well, I'm a freelance editor, and that has branched out into being a colorist just by default.
I'm a model with Greg. Thank you.
Thank you. In addition, I write for one of the trade journals, Digital Video Magazine, and their associated website, and then I kind of repurpose some of that content on my own blog. So a little bit of everything.
How did you get started?
Originally in radio, and then broadcast television from there, and then moved to the Post environment. Worked for a couple of different post houses, and as the economy took a downturn, they suffered, and I went freelance through no choice of my own. And it's worked out fine ever since.
Yes, freelance is in another type of business. It's consultant.
Exactly.
Yes.
Well, it's the usual story of you got the boot out of the door, and if you had thought about doing that on your own, you never would have made that move.
Yeah. Was that a good move for you then?
Yeah, it's turned out fine. You miss certain things about being staff, and you gain other things that are, a benefit.
You get to work from home, which is a plus and a minus.
Actually, not that much. I tend to go to other people's facilities, so I have, a fair amount of regular clients that I do work for, and then occasionally I work at home, but not all that much.
Is it easy to get a break into the industry?
I'd say no. I'd say it's harder now than ever because there's, when you used to have regular facilities and they had some sort of a, number of entry-level jobs, or in bigger places apprenticeship type roles, those opportunities have largely evaporated. So, unless you know somebody or you have some sort of entrepreneurial sense yourself, you don't really have those opportunities the way you used to. And so I think it's more of a challenge for somebody going through college and trying to get a job in the industry, of just finding the right place in. I think broadcasters are a place where people still tend to find, entry-level positions. A lot of the broadcasters are doing a certain amount of web content like everybody else, and they tend to have more junior people that are sort of in that predator role where they're shooter, producer, editor, and web producer, and that's an area where they can break in.
Because there's a lot of, they call it second screen, and there's a lot of almost like spin-off opportunities for some shows where there's like a second string of a show.
Yeah.
And so I guess that's a way of it, because it's not the main program, it's a place where people can kind of cut their teeth, and it's not quite so mission critical.
Yeah, and a lot of broadcasters also have other social things they're involved in. So, it's sort of the what's happening around town moment, and those are things that they wouldn't necessarily put on the air anymore. They used to do that as public service programs. You'd have a public service producer that would produce some of these things. Now that's stuff that they can use to populate their website, in addition to just repurposing the breaking news, and it gives an opportunity, and obviously good marketing for the station because it's an outreach to the community.
If that's the way to break in, what advice would you give somebody who's trying to get into a career at the moment?
Well, I think in every aspect you want to learn every element of the business these days. Certainly understanding the web is a good place to start, and you can no longer really specialize in being just a shooter or just a producer. I think you have to know a little bit of all aspects of the business.
Is there more opportunity though? I mean, can people break into not into necessarily the broadcast market or to the feature film market, but there is a lot more, is there more opportunity in corporate and education? I mean, BISC, for example, employ like dozens of editors.
Right. I mean, I think there's a lot of opportunity. I think there's also a lot of opportunity for people creating their own businesses.
Right, that's true.
You know, because the cost of entry is so low.
Yeah.
And I think that's not just in software, but I think when, you know, Canon 5Ds came out and started to become accepted as a viable professional tool, they're not cheap, but they certainly are a lot cheaper than if you had gone out and tried to buy a Vericam or a Red or something like that. So there's definitely an opportunity for the people who, you know, are entrepreneurial in that sense. So I guess where in years past that might be somebody who decided to become a wedding photographer, now you have people that are, you know, doing that with video and also extending that to other media specialties.
Well, that was my career path. I just created my own opportunity by setting up my own business.
Right.
Fortunately, I had indulgent enough parents that I could get through that stage. Most people don't decide to go out and finance, you know, $70,000 or $80,000 worth of gear just as a starting point for a business.
Yes, correct.
I guess the opportunity thing is sort of a little bit of a double-edged sword, because of course there is more opportunity, because quite literally there is so much more video production than there was 20 years ago. So there has to be more opportunity, but at the same time there's more of a, I want to say, an awareness of what is video, and maybe it's a potential career path, whereas I think the barriers of entry before were so high that nobody even thought about it, or thought, you know, if they were interested, it wasn't for them. So there is kind of a tension of more opportunity, but more people clamoring for the still quite limited spaces that there is available to do that.
I think, you know, part of that is, though, that message isn't necessarily getting out.
Okay.
I mean, I tend to see people, well, you know, students in college who are still looking at it as a sort of traditional path of, I'll go out and get a job somewhere. And to a large extent, that's not the reality of this business. And there are a number of for-profit universities that I think probably do a better job of preparing people for that. And for-profit universities certainly have, you know, been slammed for their method of operation, but some actually do quite good. And, you know, honestly, when you look at the cost of going through those versus the cost of going to another regular state university as an out-of-state student, for example, it's actually fairly comparable. Thank you.
Interesting.
One of the things that always comes up when your name is mentioned is, it was like, Oliver Peters, yeah, he's really fair and unbiased.
Yes.
Why do you think that is?
Well, you know, I try. Well, first of all, from a standpoint of the journalistic side, I do try to look at it as a fair assessment of something. So even if it's something that I don't think is appropriate for professionals in sort of the traditional video and film sense, I do have to look at it and say, well, okay, wait a minute, let me step back and think about who this product was created for.
Right.
And then is it appropriate for that? So from a standpoint of just the journalistic side, I sort of take that approach to it mentally. And, you know, I also know that all of these companies, whether you think they have a horrible product or a great product, there are people putting a lot of effort behind it.
Oh, of course.
And you don't want to just criticize something for the sake of criticizing it.
Yes, on the internet it's very, very easy to just sort of say, oh, I tried this product and it sucks.
Right.
And people sort of do that, and
Yeah.
because there are very few faces that people associate with some of these things, it's kind of very easy to be as dismissive as that. But having gotten to know the people in these companies, and they're very, very passionate and very, very dedicated and incredibly smart people, and they truly believe in their product, otherwise they wouldn't be there.
We're the same. I mean, you know, we get emails from people implying that we put something out on the market that was untested and didn't work and didn't do the job that was there for it. And I mean, it's personally offensive for a start, but just it's illogical that somebody would put out a product that was likely to fail or wasn't going to do the job, because internet, you know, the word gets out extremely quickly if something is not up to scratch.
It's far more likely that the customer didn't read the manual.
Well, and internet forums tend to take on a life of their own, right?
Exactly.
Threads start to degenerate very quickly, and you say things in response to people that you would never say to them face to face.
Right.
And in a sense, something like NAB is good because you do tend to run into people that you may have sparred a bit with verbally on the internet, and it gives you a chance to meet them face to face and go, oh, you're so-so. Well,
Yeah.
Oh, you're not a monster.
It's one of the reasons why Creative Cow in particular, but other forums, stopped this idea of having a screen name, an anonymous name, that you had to put your name so that you had a name associated with your comments, which at least goes part way towards mitigating some of the uglier sides of the internet. Although Creative Cow has had some ugly moments, but that's okay.
Well, there are a couple of forums that are sort of set aside for people arguing for the sake of arguing.
True.
But the other side of that is, over the course of the years, I've done billable work on probably 15 different NLEs. And if I add the ones that I've reviewed but didn't do billable work on, it's another 10 or so more. And so that gives you maybe a little bit different perspective than somebody who's only ever edited on one or two pieces of software.
That's, I think, part of the reason why you have the reputation for fairness, because you really do have a far better perspective on the various NLEs than the majority of working professionals do. Also, you're a real working professional, so there.
Well, unfortunately, that tends to make you start feeling kind of old. The other day, yeah, I was explaining to some guy who was, pretty senior position at, one of the main post houses in the U.S.
Right.
And I said something, and it was in the 80s roughly, and he goes, "Dude, I was in high school."
Well, it's not so much that you have age, so much as that you have wisdom. So think of it that way. Reframe this. Come on.
Well, I mean, that you do have a degree of internet fame. I mean, what do you think about that?
Oh, I don't know. I think it's good and bad. For the most part, you tend to get recognized a bit, but I don't think about it a whole lot. I do, like anybody else who posts things on blogs and so on. You go, oh, it's nice that I'm getting this many views on something. So from that standpoint, it's interesting.
Does it unlock any doors?
Business-wise?
Yeah, I guess business-wise mostly.
No, I don't think so. I can't say that I've ever gotten a job off of that.
Have you ever lost one because of it?
No. I do get people who ask me for free advice, and I'm more than happy to give that. I mean, if it's a legitimate question, and if they take the time to contact me directly, then they're not trolling for something. But generally people who do the hiring for certain freelance things I might work on don't necessarily frequent the kind of forums and places where I pop up.
You have to taste this.
Yeah, right.
It's delicious.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Get a little bit of the almond too, because it's smoked almond. I mean, it sounds ridiculous. It's just like apple and cheese and almond.
It's good.
Yeah.
Fi-Fi tapas in Las Vegas because we're here for NAB, and so we had to. It's a good opportunity to catch people that we are physically hard to have lunch with.
True. Now you need to do IBC and catch.
Oh, we did 3 at IBC last year.
I probably watched those. I didn't.
There's one with Bart.
Yeah.
There's one with Maxim.
That's right. That's the one.
Did we do a third? No, we were trying to get Simon. I think we only did the 2.
Yeah, I think that's right. Yeah.
And that was the one time when Apple's Final Cut Pro 10 auto sync in the multicam didn't do the perfect job that I normally expected to do, because during the lunch period, the background atmosphere got so loud that it no longer could distinguish in the camera audio the actual dialogue that we had on the mic. So it slipped the sync somewhat. But it's not hard to readjust the sync there.
You know, there's an answer to that. You can shoot with timecode.
Well, yes, but timecode requires a whole lot of extra stuff. Like, for example, a back for the GoPro that's more expensive than the GoPro itself, and then a timecode generator and transmitter and all.
That's right. That was announced last week, wasn't it?
Yes, you can actually do timecode with GoPros.
Oh, really? Oh, that's good.
Timecode Buddy people have got what do they call it, timecode backpack.
Because there's a thing I ran into this morning. Telestream, as part of their Vantage, which is their enterprise product, makes a camera ingest module, and it will what they call time align. So let's say you've got a camera and you've shot over the course of a day and it's got a bunch of stop starts. It'll go through and string it out against time, put in slugs into the file, and do that for all your cameras. So now the editor gets something that's already mapped against time without having to create that sort of a sync map.
Yeah, I've done up to about a 5-hour multicam on Final Cut Pro 10. Not intentionally, just simply because I thought, what would happen if I sent all of this 5-hour shoot with a 2-hour gap in the middle to it and say, make me a multicam? And
We were doing a shoot for cooking a Thanksgiving turkey, so there was all the turkey prep and everything associated with that, and then it goes in the oven, and then go away for 2 hours and come back. We take all of that footage and you put it in a single multicam in Final Cut 10, and it just puts the great big slug exactly for the right time period. So we ended up with a 5-hour multicam.
took about 12 minutes. And the first pass didn't work well because I hadn't named my camera angles.
Right.
Which is, I think, kind of essential with Final Cut 10. I don't know if it is as essential with Pluralize or with Premiere Pro, but I know in 10 you really do need to...
Camera angles are metadata, you should respect the metadata.
I should respect the metadata, after all. I'm known for it.
I think the last multicam I did in Final Cut 10 was a big corporate thing, and it was, like some of these, it's a keynote and it goes on for an hour and a half, 2 hours till somebody finally shuts up, and that was all multicam, and worked fine. And in fact, on that job, I was using 10, the other editor was using Premiere, and he was running into actually quite a few crashing issues. Subsequently, we've both worked on another job, and it was fine, so go figure.
It could have been something to do with a media format or...
Just gremlins.
Well, they were recording everything on KeyPros, so we got KeyPros from... Yeah.
That should have been nice and clean.
Should have been, yeah.
Do you tend to embrace technology change or fight it?
I probably fight it the first year, and then I embrace it after that. I mean, take Final Cut 10 as an example, right? There's a major change in how that program operated versus 7.
Yeah.
And my history with 7 had been, I came from a media composer background. And I worked at a number of facilities that, had Media Composer, and then the boss decided we're going to go with Final Cut 7. And taking the typical Media Composer approach, editor approach, is like, oh, if it could only do this and it could only do that. And, I sort of came to that realization, if I keep saying this, I'm going to put myself out of a job. Because they're just going to find somebody who's fine with the tool.
Yeah.
So at that point, you do the sensible thing and you dig in a little deeper and you go, okay, this is actually pretty good. And that's years, yeah. And at that point, you start going through and, study it, work at it a little harder, and you become good at it. And so, fast forward to Final Cut 10. You have to kind of remember in the back of your head, oh, wait a minute, this was my attitude back then. I need to, remember that. And see what there is to embrace about that. So I tend to run hot and cold in those things. And so when I look at something like virtual reality or stereo 3D, my natural inclination is to be a skeptic and not to be such a cheerleader for the technology. On the other hand, I tend to work all kinds of different jobs. I've done TV commercials, corporate videos, indie feature films, whatever.
Yeah.
And being based out of Orlando, you also do a lot of themed attraction work. You tend to work in stuff that goes at Disney, at Universal, at SeaWorld, and there are all kinds of companies that have kind of grown out of, X Imagineers and X whatever the equivalent department is at Universal and so on.
Right.
And they likewise, create little themed attractions for museums and theme parks all over the world. And so there's a lot of that. And so I tend to see projects that are sort of one-off special venue projects that are oddball screen sizes and configurations and use, experimental technology. And so you look at something like VR and go, okay, yeah, it's a niche, but it could be a very big niche, and I see it in this kind of an application.
Yeah, VR. Has there been was there a lot of VR on the show floor, Philip? Did you see? So I know it was before NAB. People were talking about it a lot, and it's kind of exciting. But it also feels like, haven't we heard this before? Isn't this just 3D all over again?
I don't know. I was always a 3D skeptic along with Terry.
Yeah.
VR and 4K, I've diverged from Terry on those. 4K, I think for acquisition makes a lot of sense. Distribution, maybe the few people. It will become the de facto distribution simply because people will buy a replacement TV and it will be a 4K set and at the same price point.
Well, I think with VR though, it is a different aspect than 3D, because 3D, you could transpose all of your standard cinematic production techniques. You had to, you had to be a little careful about some of the cutting, but for the most part, it was the same production you would have always done. I don't think VR is like that. VR, as I was explaining to somebody yesterday, let's say you do a little short film that runs in a theme park. However, just an example. First of all, you don't want to move the camera because then you're inducing the things that cause people to have motion sickness. And it almost seems like it becomes sort of a Birdman kind of production where you really have to plan out or even previs how you're going to structure the show, if you're going to have edits, how you're going to hide them. And so then, let's say like this, it's a table of people talking. If somebody's over here on the side, you don't have the luxury as a director to cut to that angle. You have to force something to get the person to turn their head and talk. So audio becomes a very integral part of the project, and it has to shift. So as I turn my head, you want that perspective to match in your ears. So I think we're quite a ways away from having all the pieces and parts to do a really good VR. But then you get other, potential, like some of the Tim Dashwood stuff, where you've got a...
Is everything okay at the moment? Right?
Yes.
Yeah, because may I take that to replace?
Sure, absolutely. So in the case of some of the Tim Dashwood stuff, where you could shoot something with a 360 camera and add this pan following around, into an otherwise linear program.
Yeah. One of the things that directors have always wanted to do is control where people look. At any, one of the jobs of the director and editor is really to keep people looking where we want them to look at, not just randomly looking around.
Right.
Whereas with VR, people can randomly look around. So, as you said, we've got to do audio and other techniques to make them look where we really want them to be looking, at the same time having the flexibility to turn around. I know Lucas Wilson, who's a huge an evangelist for VR, and 3D before that. So Lucas Wilson is a fan. but at the moment, VR is he's probably my go-to person on VR anyway. But he said on one example, they do a sound effect that causes you to look this way,
Right.
and then when you look back, you're on stage at a concert. So if you hadn't looked around, it'd just be a straight cut.
Right.
Because you look away and go back, it's magical.
Yeah.
So
No,
the-
definitely.
The different format is creating a different different shooting style, different
I
whole
think it
production
has
style.
to, because it's so hard to hide the crew, or you can't hide the crew because you can't see a boom pole coming in because there's nowhere that's out of shot.
Right.
Virtually, I mean, generally the camera mount is faked over with a plate for the floor rather than so that we can still see it.
Yeah, I think all of these technologies impose some different thought processes in how you do production. And I think to some extent that's also true, when animation on animated films is done in a certain way and you start to get a real DP involved. I think they impose a different production thought process than maybe an animation technical director would in structuring a scene. And Pixar's done that where they've brought in, Roger Deakins or somebody like that to really kind of sit down and teach the animators, okay, these are the things I think about when I light a scene or I, choreograph camera movement.
Right, yes. Having people who have experienced the physical world and translating it into the animated world helps make the animation more realistic, I guess, yeah.
And of course for a DP, it also, you realize, wait a minute, there are places I can place the camera that would be impossible otherwise in the real world. I could go under the floor and shoot, showing up.
Oh yeah, how interesting. They give a lot more flexibility, yeah. But surely, with all this technology, really it comes back down to compelling stories. Whether the story is compelling in 2D, 3D or VR, then surely it's a compelling story.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately we're, hopefully storytellers rather than technicians. And
But so many people start in the industry because they're interested in the technology rather than the gear. I mean, this whole concept of a gear slut. I mean, it keeps NAB alive, I suppose.
Well, I do a little bit of teaching, and I always see that in students where obviously they got into it because they're really jazzed about the technology.
Guilty.
And particularly students who are interested in editing, they get overly impressed with plug-in effects and so on, and you really have to kind of say, okay, well, let's set that aside. Let's learn the basics first. And some of them get very married to a particular tool. More so than people who've been doing this for a while. And you really have to sort of start out the class with, okay, we're going to teach this tool, but don't get too hung up. Learn the concepts more so than the tool, because by the time you're actually out and being paid to use this tool, it may not be the dominant tool in the industry.
Editors are like ducklings; they imprint on the first NLE they're introduced to.
Yeah.
Well, you remember the days I was vociferously enthusiastic about Media 100 because that was my choice. Right. And I think people feel they have to defend their choice as being the right choice, even if it's not the right choice for somebody in an entirely different area. That's truthfully what I learned from the Avid list. Yeah. Was that what I was saying was valid, but it's not valid everywhere. Yeah. And it was a great learning experience for me, coming from a fairly insular, regional city.
Right.
Where I was the first NLE in the city. In fact, there were 3 Media 100s before there was ever a media composer in. I think because of that.
Yeah.
But it's often hard to learn that the choice you make is not the only viable choice, and a very good tool could be exactly the wrong tool.
Well, I mean, I certainly, I do very little media composer editing anymore. I do some client dependent. But that's the first NLE I started editing on. So I still have a soft spot in my heart for both the company and the NLE, because I like the tool. It does a lot of really good things. But also prior to that time, I had been an online linear editor. And so Media Composer actually sort of gave me that opportunity to move into more, creative editing, and to actually do some indie feature films and some things like that that I would have never been able to do as a linear editor.
Yeah.
So, it created that opportunity, and so, for that reason as well, it's, still I have sympathy for their problems, and that's yours. I have the cod. Yes. Okay. When you look at a company like that and you go, I can't really see how they've managed to stay in business, but I also can't envision a world quite yet without them.
Video Composer has a very unique position, I think, because it was the first professional NLE, and for a long time was the only viable for television and film work, and yet the industry has gone on, and where once upon a time Video Composer had 95% of the NLE market in the...
Yeah, we were talking about Media Composer, and of course this weekend they had Avid Connect.
Yeah.
And even though the most recent release is a really good release, it got zero mention in any of their roundup of new products. But, certainly in the greater conference, it got some attention. But some of the things they've done is they've unified menus in a more logical way. But yesterday I'm in the booth and I'm listening to somebody else just, really give the demo guy, the application specialist, a hard time about, why did they change the menus? All my guys are, they hate that.
Moving things around, making them more efficient, more logical.
People want everything to improve without changing,
Yeah.
not recognizing that this is not possible.
Well, and things like that where, it's muscle memory involved.
Yes. Although I find that as I swap between NLEs and other applications, my mind swaps keystroke equivalents is in my brain. I seem to have it mapped per application.
Mine too, but it does take me sometimes half a day to
Readjust it.
and that's actually worse if I'm on a PC for a session as opposed to a Mac than it is going between applications, mainly because just control and command get swapped around.
Right, yeah. What do you think has been the biggest change in technology since you started your career?
Well, certainly everything's gotten smaller and cheaper. So I think just the ease of doing things has been a huge change. It's been a driver for just about everything.
You should have one of these for protection because you'll be in the car with me and they're very garlicky.
So I don't know that there's any one particular thing that you can sit there and go, okay, well this is like a huge change. I think so much of it has changed.
Yeah.
It used to be walking through NAB. Part of the fun of walking through NAB was the hardware.
Yes.
Right? And you got to the point where, all right, this booth is a screen with a menu on it, and this booth is a screen with a menu. And at one point I think I said, television trucks is about the only place where the manly arts of television are still practiced, because you had a switcher with a fader bar. And
Fortunately, hardware's now become important again because we have the drones. We walked through there today and Central Hall is really quite cool, not because it's overly air conditioned, but because of the downdraft of all of those drones in those cages and that buzzing sound. Yes.
It opens up a lot of new opportunities, though. I think the internet, that's given us as a technology foundation as we've developed. The ability to find out quickly a technique refresh. I've got this problem.
Yeah.
Well, you could go to a VAR, and if they are really knowledgeable and researched everything, they might have an idea where that problem is. But if you can access the collective knowledge of 1,000 or 5,000 or 10,000 people, it just changes the equation so much.
You're essentially crowdsourcing the information.
Even down to needing to change it. I needed to change the temperature, the maximum temperature on our shower in the new place we moved into, because it was like it's stopping here, and It's hotter in the sink in there, but why is it cold here? And
It was a safety thing that prevented it going to an area where you could scald yourself.
Scald yourself.
So a quick Google search, and there's a little video on the internet. Says, oh, I just need to undo this and pull that grommet out and put it, and I've saved myself a call to a plumber who would have this specialised knowledge that now everybody can share without having to pay the professional. I guess that's something that we've been fighting in production as well.
I think there is an analog there, though, because what tends to happen is you do it the first time because you didn't want to call the plumber, and you do such a lousy job that you go, maybe the next time I really need to call the plumber. And I think some of that same occurs in video, where it's like, okay, this really doesn't have the impact that I thought it was going to be. Let me bring somebody in.
Yeah. Well, there's still a place for the professional. It's just that people are more reluctant to expect that they need to do that and therefore need to pay for that.
But just because you've got a copy of Microsoft Word doesn't mean you can write the great American novel. Right. And so if you've got Final Cut or iMovie or whatever, it doesn't mean that you're a storyteller.
Yeah. One of the advantages, though, of this change in cost and size and weight and everything else is that it's had great benefit for the professionals as well. Right. You know, if you think about something like a director of photography, so 10, 15 years ago, maybe they invested in one really good high-end camera, and that's what they had. They had a camera and sticks and lights and so on. Right. The equivalent of that person today, you know, the young DP getting into business, they no longer come to the mix with a single camera because they've been able to afford several. So 2-camera productions are the standard approach, and they may have a grab bag of tricks, right? I've got some GoPros to do this kind of a shot. I've got, you know, a C300 for my hero stuff. I've got a drone, you know, and I've got decent lighting and so on. So all of a sudden, it's a completely different kind of toolkit that they can bring to a shoot that is because the technology has given them that advantage.
Well, I think that these days the better investment is in lenses.
Well, it's certainly the stable investment because it's going to hold its value as long as, you know, it's a PL or an EF mount or something that's going to be around for a while. That's going to have its benefit. I mean, I've cut tons of stuff where the DP has wanted some, you know, old vintage lens, you know, because quote unquote it takes the edge off that digital image, you know.
In other words, it's a bit soft.
It's a bit soft. It probably has a little chromatic aberration. I mean, I did one show where the DP used Bosch and Lohm lenses. I've never heard of Bosch and Lohm lenses, but apparently for a very limited period of time, they made photographic and cinema lenses. And these were not the greatest lenses, but they certainly gave a character to the image that, yeah, I actually thought was quite nice. Unfortunately, they flared a lot to the point that, you know, flare was a minor character in the film. But
like a J.J. Abrams film.
Fortunately, it wasn't quite that bad. But, you know.
Well, if they're the biggest changes so far, what do you think will be the biggest change in the rest of your career?
Well, I think distribution is going to be a big challenge, and how media is stored and saved. I think that's a nut that hasn't completely been cracked yet. I mean, we've got cloud-based systems of various types, but you really don't have a system where you're going to put up terabytes of original raw footage in the cloud and directly work with it. And I do see that coming at some point, and clearly that's a technology that you know, is on an accelerated path, so I don't see why it wouldn't. So I think that's going to be a huge change. You know, the ability to have your media archive anywhere. And, you know, people already edit on mobile platforms of some sort. I don't think they're particularly conducive. I mean, I've got an iPad and I've got a couple of editing programs on there, but I don't find the process enjoyable. If I'm going to, if I'm going to do that, I would bring along a laptop or whatever. And so I think that's going to be a huge change. I'm not quite sure about how we consume media. I think that's going to be, but it's already changing, right? I mean, I know you're big into some of the automated editing potential.
Well, yeah. For taking the drudgery out. I mean, there's a lot of preparatory work and fairly routine work to get to the point where you start being creative. On a feature film, stringing out the stuff as to the script, using the best takes, is not the job of editing the movie. Right. Although I think that's what a lot of people consider it to be. Yeah. But that starting point, that string out of all the best takes in the order that the script had them, is not very often the finished movie. It's generally too long, right, and it has to be filtered back down, and it has to be trimmed down, or in cases sometimes the editor decides that really the structure that the director wants isn't the right structure for communicating that story. And we have a yet unpublished lunch with Philip and Greg with somebody who was saying that on The Fugitive, the editor suggested to the director that really the linear story wasn't the way to start. That the story starts halfway through, and flashback to the early part was a better structure for conveying that story.
So the story was changed by the editor during the editing process.
So you see, our goal is to use whatever technology can to make getting to that point as easy as it can be, particularly with non-scripted. That's the area that I tend to play with most. But yeah, but I don't think we can take over the creative role of an editor. I mean, we can get it assembled, and that's a perfectly adequate edit for many purposes. If you want to explore a family history video material, you want to just assemble something that's acceptably put together so that it doesn't jar.
Yeah.
And currently I'm doing some work that involves a bunch of creation of automated sequences, but it's not at all storytelling, because it's for a corporate product that I can't talk about, that that there's no story, but having an editor sit down and put this together manually is stupid and tedious and unnecessary.
But by and large, the same moves applied to the same type of photograph of a different product.
Yeah.
And then because it's regimented enough and consistent enough, automating it makes sense. But stuff that's not that consistent, no.
Yeah.
Well, it's basically a templarization, however you want to call it.
Terry and I have had conversations on templarization many times, and in fact, I was talking to somebody at the show about whether they are planning within their iOS app to have templates that people can then just shoot to the template. And I think that's a great idea for people who are not experienced in production. I mean, Apple's trailers the iMovie trailers were an example where most people really only want to see the trailer of your holiday. They don't really want to see all your holiday video. And if by saying put this type of thing, this type of shot, this type of shot, this type of shot, and having derived metadata for identifying those types of shots, then that makes it easier for consumers to get a result that they're pleased with, that they can show to people without it happening. So I think there is a big future for templarization.
Not just consumers, because you could imagine that a real estate video could be templarized.
Oh yeah.
It's very regimented. I think even a wedding, because there's really not a lot of creativity in a wedding. They tend to do the same sort of thing.
I don't know. I mean, I know people who are doing drones and turning around an edited video before the end of the ceremony. I think that's pretty impressive.
It's impressive.
So,
but is it storytelling?
Well, I had done a wedding video one time for a friend, and the videographer shot DV, and at that time I was cutting in a linear bay, so I transferred all the mini DV tapes to Digibeta, and he recycled the mini DV tapes. So I'm editing along and had my friend, the groom, come in just to kind of take a look at the thing, and during the reception he kind of goes, "Wait a minute, that's not our wedding." I go, "What do you mean?" I said, "Well, first of all, they look like they're having more fun than we had, but we rolled back a little, and sure enough, what had happened is, at some point the DJ's doing shout, and everybody's like, and the tape had rolled through where he had stopped the recording, had a little bit of breakup, and came back into an old chunk. The time-based corrector had stabilized it so it didn't, crash the recording, and coincidentally, it was roughly at a very similar point in the reception. So yeah, sometimes stuff like that, you go, okay, there should be a template for this sort of thing.
Well, I think given the right amount of metadata, you could really build a wedding video fairly automatically.
As far as things that I think could still be improved, anything related to transcripts is still kind of an area that needs,
We have no interest in transcripts at all. Did you see the announcement from Digital Heaven? I'm very excited about that.
Yeah, I want to give that a test and see what that, how well that works.
Because if it works, that's going to be so hot.
Yes.
There's such a demand for automated transcription.
Right. Yeah.
Plus, our interest is not entirely altruistic, because if we have automated transcription as the front end to magic keywords that we just announced, then we have the point where we can go from, well, here's my raw material and here's my first string out of a topic.
So Martin, we want to be on the beta program, please.
Well, exactly. I mean, that's the sort of area where it'd be nice to actually edit the page.
Well, that was the goal of Credit. I don't know if you remember that one that we had for Final Cut 7, where you could add metadata to the transcript. You could break the transcript up into bits and then drag them around and move them into a story, and even
Subclipping just by hitting a carriage return and breaking a paragraph.
Right. And in other areas, sort of, I don't know, maybe automating the comparison. If you've got an interview with 10 different people looking for that match of similarities between this person, this person, this person talking about the same topic, so you can sit there and go, oh, okay, he's stronger versus this. And then ultimately to balance those interviews out so that you're not predominantly on one person only. I think those are areas that some level of automation would be possible. How much interest that is from a financial standpoint is hard to say, because I don't know that many editors would ultimately pay for that versus just saying, that's not how I work.
And maybe the producer has a different opinion.
And maybe that becomes a producer's tool where, okay, here's a starting point.
Yeah.
It's certainly, I think transcripts are getting a little bit more important these days in a smaller subset of the industry. But when you're looking at things like having to, if you're trying to broadcast a network, you have to give the network the paper cut that really represents what's going to go on screen, and you have to have the closed captioning. Right. So therefore, we need to have the text from whatever is in the program.
Or you need to be able to generate a transcript from the as cut.
That's what I meant.
And that would need to tie back to some metadata that identifies the speaker. As well. So there's a lot of stuff there that needs work, but certainly there's some sort of a need for it.
And there are levels of acceptable transcript. For the TV, for the subtitling or closed captioning, it has to be word perfect. To derive metadata for doing those sort of story string outs of the main points, it doesn't have to be that accurate. We just need to make sure that the important points are accurate.
Well, a lot of these things we're talking about sort of efficiency of the process. And if you look at the way traditional Hollywood works, if you're talking about the top end feature films, it's a very inefficient process in many ways. And one of the takeaways in interviewing and listening to the guys from Focus and now Whiskey Tango, a lot of the efficiency, tools aside, was derived from really two things: staying native with media that was QuickTime and not raw files and everything else, and doing so much in-house. And a lot of the rest of the world has been working that way for a while. It's just sort of a revelation in Hollywood.
Yes, it is exactly that. When during Focus, Sam Messman kept coming back to us and saying, "You guys don't know what you got with Sync-N-Link. We can do our dailies in house. We don't have to send them out for the daily house." So essentially, they cut out in WTF. They cut out that part of the budget. But the thing was, it was just the feature film industry coming to the realization of what the television industry has been doing for quite some time.
Because Dean Devlin at Electric, they were a beta tester of our Sync-N-Link for Final Cut 7. Well, they were the ones that pushed us to do the Final Cut 10 version, because they needed that so that they could do Season 5 of Leverage, because they were so used to being able to have all of that happening in-house. And they do a whole bunch of other stuff in-house.
Oh yeah.
They do color in-house, they do audio in-house, they do the whole...
One of the previous jobs I had was at Century 3, which was the post house on the lot at Universal. And we were sort of up in business during the, beginnings of Hollywood East, as it was called, which never really went anywhere. But we did quite a few scripted television series that went through. And everything was in-house. And part of the reason it was in-house because there weren't a whole lot of other resources anyway, which of course made producers nervous, because if they don't like what you're doing, then
They don't have a choice.
right. But everything offline, online finishing, visual effects, audio post, everything except scoring the music was done in-house, and it makes for a very efficient process. Not to mention we cut the trailers in-house, promos in those cases because it was TV shows. But yeah, it's literally you walk down the hall and say, "Oh, by the way, this, and this has changed," and so it's those kinds of efficiencies that most feature films never go through. And I don't know whether it's just because most directors don't want to take on that headache, or whether there's a cost factor. Ultimately, you get down to the trust that the studio has in what you're doing. And I think this goes back to, like the early stuff Fincher did, where he was trying to, again, move everything more in-house, and he got a lot of pushback from the executives, basically on the fact that, wait a minute, who are we entrusting to carry these digital mags from the set, because it's, how's that going to work? How's that safe? And essentially the answer they gave them was, it's going to be the same people who are moving the exposed negative back to the, and they went, oh, okay, I guess you're right.
I guess that's good enough.
Yeah. If nothing changes, that's probably okay.
Exactly.
Do you think it's important for a modern editor to have a balance of skills? Or, I think we alluded to this earlier, that it's no longer enough to just be an editor.
Yes, I certainly, you're kind of a jack of all trades these days.
Except maybe at the feature film end.
Correct. You definitely need to have some skills in effects, whether it's inside the application or bouncing out to After Effects. You need to have some graphics sense. Granted, most editors aren't necessarily good designers, but you really have to understand how to manipulate the tools. Basic audio mixing, basic color correction. I mean, certainly in the smaller markets, where you're going to do commercials, corporate videos, that's always done by one or two people. So if you don't have that skill set, you're really kind of hurting from job skills.
Because increasingly the previews have to be kind of like finished films. They don't want, they can't have temp graphic, well, they can have temp graphics, but they got to look almost as good as the finished graphics. They can have temp titles, but they've got to be looking as good, and the audio's got to be mixed, and it's raising the bar at every point. Even though there's, I think it's because the producers have lost the skill of understanding a non-finished cut.
Well, yeah, I mean, producers have, from a standpoint of how a producer interacts in the edit bay, that's gone significantly downhill since the days of linear editing. I mean, it used to be that you could give a producer or the director, whoever was, making those decisions, a 3/4 or a VHS burn-in with time code, and they'd come back with a paper list of edit points of, pretty much having roughed out the spot without ever having edited anything. They just did by the numbers. And I see very few people with that skill, and I see very few people who actually are engaged in the edit anymore. It's, no, I don't have time to sit in, post a cut and let me look at it and then I'll give you my feedback. Yeah. And sometimes that becomes very inefficient just because it's like, come on, can you come in for an hour and sit with us and we can go through the options rather than...
I walked in an edit bay at the end of it to change some gear out at the end of a working day, and I overheard the director saying to the editor, well, we cut out 45 seconds today, it's a pretty good day. So the job for the entire day was to eliminate 45 seconds of duration from a movie. It's like, okay, this is a world I'm not used to.
Sometimes that can be hard. Sometimes that can be hard.
At one of the Editors Lounge panels a couple of years back, one of the panelists said that the worst thing that ever happened to post-production was Media Composer. because, with 3/4 inch you were given 2 or 3 weeks to shape the story. You could have time to engage with the material a little bit better. Right. Whereas now the same material's given to you and you better have a cut at the end of the week. And by the way, we need a second cut for online and we need some other things done as well.
Well, yeah, I mean, different versions. And everybody pretty much says the same thing. Whatever time it took, it still takes the same amount of time. You're just either doing more or it's gotten more complex in how you're doing it. I would say the thing that's impacted editors more so than that over the years is multiple cameras. The wealth of footage, and not always in a good way. Indie features have followed all the big guys and figure automatically we need 2 cameras for every shoot. And having cut those kinds of films, I hardly ever find the second camera to be all that useful. I'd say probably 25% at the most out of that second camera, because it's either in the wrong place because the A camera is in the only good place, or crew are partially blocking some of the footage. So I don't see a lot of usefulness to that, as opposed to just simply sitting down and blocking out the shots correctly.
On the other hand, I don't think we could do this with only one camera.
Well, true. I mean,
even if we had a cameraman,
right.
it'd still be it would be horrible to cut.
Yeah.
And I do find that with the cooking show that, yes, 80% of what I use is the front on the DSLR camera, but it's really useful to have the GoPro overhead shot. Yeah. You can advance the action a lot more if you can cut away and come back.
But I mean, that's pretty standard television technique, right? Television, and that's always been multi-camera. Yeah, that's right. And so I think that's a little bit different than something that is really structured and scripted and directed, with those breaks in mind.
Of course, yes.
Yeah. So sure, there's places for both. But unfortunately, from a film standpoint, now instead of getting an hour of dailies a day, even on the lowest budget indie, you're going to get several hours a day, and up on a real major feature.
Reality TV can generate 60 hours of footage for every day they shoot.
Yeah.
I mean, it's mind-boggling to me how you even find where the story is in that, and that.
Most of it's useless.
And most of it is not going to be used because we're only producing one episode and 42 minutes and a couple of 18 other variations for the web.
Well, and I mean, reality TV is kind of its own thing anyway, just because you're sort of structuring an artificial story in the edit. I mean, you're setting up antagonisms. You're setting up antagonisms that aren't really there and how they did things and so on. I've only worked on one reality series. It was Pet Psychic for Animal Planet, which wasn't really reality. It was more like semi-documentary because there were field vignettes and so on. But even there, you'd go through and you'd have a bunch of stories laid out a certain way, and then the network would go, oh no, wait a minute, we want to do a themed week on rescue animals or something. So now all of a sudden, packages that were meant for a different show got shuffled into the shows that aired that week. And it had been edited a certain way, and now you had to go back and go, all right, now we got to go back to the interviews and see, did they say things we cut out that are applicable now to the different theme that we're trying to do?
Yeah, because they're writing the story on the fly. So
Yeah. I mean, it's definitely, that edict, that adage of, there are three movies, right? The one that's shot, the one that was, the one that was written, the one that was shot, and the one that was edited. And reality is very much like that. And that's where you have, story editors.
they're very important.
Well, and the people who do reality well as editors, not story editors, but actual cutting editors, generally get paid pretty well.
Even if
They should. Danger money.
Yes, danger money. Well, just to wrap up, what advice would you give your younger self?
Going to shoe sales. No, I think you really have to decide whether you want to be in this business. And if you want to be in this business, I think you have to look at it as, how do I structure a career that's based on entrepreneurial skills, whether you end up having a mainstream job or not. And learn a little bit about other things, not just the technology. When I started out in radio and got a job at the campus radio station and at the local PBS station my first year at school.
Oh.
And so right away I figured, wait a minute, I'm going to learn more about this business than I ever am in class. So I changed my major to what at that time was kind of a general studies, looking at it as, all right, if I'm ultimately going to do something that's more than being an operator, it would help me to know things about other industries, other disciplines, because people from the outside are going to come to you and utilize the media skills that you're presenting them. Well, it would help you to know a little bit about their business and what it is that they're trying to find out. And so, media more than anything else requires, I think, probably a very broad education, the kind of the traditional liberal arts, than learning specific pieces of technology. I mean, you have to learn the concepts, but the technology changes, especially now, so quickly, that if you've got any sense for operating technology, 6 months in, you're going to know what's going on.
Yeah.
Whether it's reading the manuals or getting your hands on it.
Reading the manuals? What a concept.
Yeah, but yeah, it's learn a little bit about everything. Be inquisitive.
Yeah.
Good advice.
Well, thank you very much for having lunch with us. If people want to see your writing and get in touch, where can they do that?
Well, easiest thing is on the blog, which is digitalfilms.wordpress.com, and just in general, it's oliverpeters.com, and there's an email there to contact me. And other than that, my writings show up on Creative Planet Network, which is digital video's website. So a little bit of all over, complaining on the cow or on the Avidel. There are other places as well. So,
Well, thanks again for coming and having lunch with us.
okay, thank you very much.